how humans process the sound of music. The musical sound involves auditory processing, whereby the musical sounds processing begins at the pinna or auricle, the visible parts of the ear that catch the sound wave or vibration information and passes to the eardrums and release the vibration information via auditory pathway to the brain, like auditory cortex for further processing. We will discuss on the auditory pathway after this. The auditory inputs involve multiple stages of processing and neural system, including ascending pathways, also known as feed-forward projections, which is from ears to the cortex. Next is a descending pathway, also known as feedback projections, processing signal released from the cortex or from higher order regions to lower order regions, and multiple parallel pathway across brain region and across brain hemisphere. The figure shows a functional framework for auditory processing. From the framework, we can see that the sensory inputs such as voices, music, or door closing, or cell phone ringing enters system and goes to the memory system to process these inputs. The sensory input influence a bottom-up and top-down attentional system to process selective attention. At this stage, a complex interaction between the new sensory inputs with the existing memory and experiences is processed. The process of sensory inputs not only occurs within the auditory system, the process actually involves the interaction across the sensory, memory, cognitive, and motor system with feed-forward and feedback and integrative processing. Here we will discuss the anatomy of the human ear. The human ear is a complex system which has the abilities to detecting and differentiate sounds and helps our body to maintain the postural equilibrium. The human ear is composed of three main parts, which are the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. The outer ear is composed of the pinna or auricle and the auditory canal. The outer ear plays the role as a receiver or acoustic antenna, where it collects sound waves and channels the sound wave to the middle ear through the ear canal, or called as meatus. The middle ear is composed of the eardrum, or also called a tympanic membrane, the tympanic cavity, and Eustachian tube. The eardrum plays a role as an amplifier that increases the efficiency of sound waves transmission to transmit through the inner ear. In the middle ear cavity, it contains the ossicles that connect to the eardrum to the inner ear. The ossicles compose of 3 little bones. The hammer, also called as malleus. The anvil, also called as incus. And the stirrup, also called as stapes, that helps transmit the sound waves to the oval window of the cochlea. Eustachian tubes works to equalize air pressure in the middle ear to the air pressure in the atmosphere. This process helps to maintain the postural balance of the human body. The inner ear is composed of 2 parts, the vestibular labyrinth and the cochlea. This is the most complex part. The vestibular labyrinth is functioning as part of the balance mechanisms of the human body, while the cochlea composed of basilar membrane, an organ of Corti, a sensory element that converts sound waves into electrical impulses for further auditory processing. The cochlea is the main sensory organ of the auditory perception, and it encoded the physical aspect of sound. The cochlea shaped like a little snail shell. It has 3 main chambers, the scala tympani, the scala media, and the scala vestibuli. The basilar membrane is a structural element located within the cochlea. The basilar membrane is the most sensitive to sound waves that determine the characteristic frequency of sound waves. Different frequency of sound wave respond selectively to different parts of the cochlea. In the visual system, the visual input perceived is retinotopically organized. The same concept also happens here in auditory system, which the sound waves perceived at the basilar membrane is topographically arranged or organized in a frequency manner called tonotopy. The sound waves travel across the basilar membrane from base to apex. The part of the membrane with narrow and stiff fiber resonates in response to high frequency sound waves, and the part of the membrane with wide and floppy fibers resonates in response to low frequency sound waves. The organ of Corti is the sensitive element in the inner ear situated on the basilar membrane. There are approximately 16,000 of the sensory receptors called hair cells distributed along the basilar membrane. Movement caused by sound waves at the basilar membrane trigger the hair cell to send action potential or a voltage pulse, and this electrical impulse travel up to the auditory pathway to the cerebral cortex. Here we will discuss further on the auditory pathway. All sounds such as musical sounds, song, speech, received in both ears is processing over time. A special feature of the auditory system is the great temporal resolution of decoding complex information in sound. The auditory system is rapid and accurate dissemination of sound information along its path. The information encoded from both ears includes many computational stages in combining and integrating in a meaningful way, includes the brainstem, to subcortical nuclei and to the cortex. As we discussed above, the ascending pathways are to relay detailed information of sounds from the periphery to the cortex. The auditory nerve conveys the neural impulse up a series of nuclei to the cortex where perception occurs. The neural impulse from peripheral auditory system arrives central auditory nuclei through the auditory nerve. These nuclei includes cochlear nuclei, superior olivary nuclei, lateral lemniscus, inferior colliculus, and medial geniculate nucleus. The ascending pathway begins at the cochlea, at the ear, continue to the auditory nerve, then continue transmit the neural impulses to ventral and dorsal cochlear nucleus. Then the neural impulse is transmitted to the ipsi and contralateral superior olivary complex. The superior olivary nucleus plays a role in detecting the time difference in sound reaching each ear, which localization of where the sound is coming from, and detecting variation in sound intensity between both ears. The pathway continues to convey the neural impulse via lateral lemniscus onto the midbrain, then continue to pass the neural signal to the inferior colliculus, then pathway extending to the medial geniculate nucleus and the auditory cortex in the left and right hemispheres. Other than a primary auditory pathway, non-primary and behavioral response pathway also involved in response to process the sound wave arrive at both ears. As we experience every day and every time, sounds that arrive at both ears are always changing over time. Thus, how the auditory pathway evaluate and mapping the sounds information is a complex one. How auditory system recognize the sound located directly in front of the head. How auditory system recognize the sound located to the sides of the head. Therefore, to localize the sounds, the auditory system has two basic types of cues, which are interaural time difference and interaural level difference. What is interaural time difference? Interaural time difference is the difference in time of the sound arrive both ear. Next, what is interaural level difference? Interaural level difference is the difference in loudness or volume and distribution of frequency between the two ears. Other than the above cues, the auditory system also will locate the sound in auditory space. To localize the sound in auditory space, a complex algorithm involved, which is head-related transfer function and also known as an anatomical transfer function. It characterizes how an ear receives a sound from a point in space. These are the cues that determine sound location in our magnificent auditory system. In human, the medial superior olivary complex is a nucleus that plays a role to locate the sound azimuth. The angle of the sound location comes from either left or right in auditory space. For example, the sound of music that plays from a radio located on the side left of the head, whereby the sound wave of music arrives slightly sooner to the left ear as compared to the right ear, which somewhat later. Therefore, the medial superior olivary complex contributes to detecting interaural time difference. The lateral superior olivary complex is a nucleus that plays a role to encode differences in sound level that arrive at the left and right ears. For example, the sound of music that plays from a radio located to the side left of the head, whereby the sound waves of the music arrive slightly louder or high volume to the left ear as compared to the right ear, which somewhat soft or low volume. Therefore, the lateral superior olivary complex contributes to detecting interaural level or intensity difference. The auditory cortex is the region that responds to multiple sound waves. Parcellation of human auditory cortex shows three types of auditory fields, which are core, belt, and parabelt. The core auditory areas comprises of the primary auditory cortex that is located within Heschel gyrus, that known as Brodmann Area 41. Primary auditory cortex is topographically organized or organized in a frequency manner. The auditory cortex consisted of several other brain regions such as planum temporal, a triangular area located on the superior temporal gyrus or STG. This auditory cortex serves as a hub to process neural impulse and interacting dynamically with other ascending and descending pathway in auditory system. Recent studies are indicating that the mapping of sound-based characteristic in human auditory cortex is complex and not fully understood. This is because of human auditory input comes from a variety of sound signals such as speech and music that contain attribute dimensions such as rhythm, timbre, and melody. Bell auditory areas or the secondary auditory areas or cortex, which are part of Brodmann Area 42, are primarily innervated by the core auditory areas and receive a neural impulse from the auditory thalamus. Parabelt areas receive neural signals from belt areas and transmit the neural signals to auditory association areas related to memory or decision making. These areas prefers in processing complex stimuli as compared to pure tones. In the visual system, there are cells responsive to where, how, and what properties of visual information. In auditory cortex, the auditory information also can be characterized to where, when, and what aspects. The arrows show the direction reflecting the auditory stream processing, where what stream identify the sound identity, either the sound input is speech or music, while the when stream identifying when the sound occurs. For example, you heard someone talking to you and suddenly a piece of loud music is coming. When stream can identify this speech comes first and music comes later. Where stream identifying the sound source or location, where the sound comes from auditory space, from which angle, from left or from the right. The figure shows the dual stream model of speech processing, ventral and dorsal streams. In the processing of speech signals, there are many streams and brain regions involved include superior and middle portion of temporal lobe in processing speech signals for comprehension, posterior plenum temporal region and posterior frontal lobe in translating acoustic-based representation of speech signals into articulatory representation, which is essential for speech production.